Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back on our journey with the Sifat, and in this video we will be talking about Shiddah, البينية and rihawa. So Bismillah, let's go ahead. In terms of learning outcomes and what we want to get out of this video, we want to get three main points. The first is to understand what Shiddah, Byinya and Rikhawa mean and associate the flow of sound to these characteristics. The second is to identify the letters of Shiddah, Byinya and Rikhawa. And the third is to understand the significance of these three characteristics when it comes to the length of letters. So Bismillah, let's start. First, let's just say that Shiddah, Byinya and Rikhawa have to do with the flow of sound, the flow of sound. Now, the last video we spoke about al-jahr and hams, that was the flow of breath. This time we're talking about Shiddah, Byinya and Rikhawa, that's a flow of sound. Some people might get them confused, but let's just put that on the table to start off with. So we are talking about the flow of sound. Let's take some examples and that will make much more sense. Let's take the Hamza. So the Hamza, when we pronounce the Hamza, we say ya, ya'murukum, ya. You see how when we said the Hamza, the sound was completely cut off. Ya. Now, could you extend the sound of the Hamza? Could you elongate it? Could you say, yeah? You can't, right? So the Hamza, the sound is cut off. It's very short, it's very sharp. Yeah. Okay, another letter. Let's say we take the Dal. Ad. Now, can you try to extend the sound of the Dal? Could we say ad? It doesn't quite work, right? Or ta. It doesn't work. So you see, in these three letters, the sound was restricted. The flow of sound was restricted. We couldn't kind of extend the sound of the letter. It was sharp. It was restricted. Now let's take some other letters. Let's take the alif maddiya. When we say could you try to extend the sound of the alif? We could. We could say you see, I could go on for a while here. You could extend the sound of the alif. Now let's take the sheen. Ash. Could you extend the sound of the sheen? Ash. So you're able to extend the sound. So you see, when we pronounce it correctly, of course, it's and ash. So I'm exaggerating just to get the point across. But with these letters, you see how the sound flows with the letter. The sound flows when we pronounce ash. So that's kind of the complete other end of the spectrum versus the ones that the sound doesn't flow, like the Hamza, ya, the Dal, ad, or ad. So the takeaway from this example is just to clarify that in some letters, the sound doesn't flow, it's cut, it's sharp. While in other letters, the sound does flow. And that's the concept we talk about when we talk about Shiddah, Byinya and Rikhawa. So when we talk about Shiddah, Shiddah is for those letters, or it's a characteristic of letters where the sound doesn't flow or is imprisoned. So the letters that have Shiddah are combined in the statement Ajid qatin bakat. So the Hamza, ya, you see how the sound is cut? Ya. Very short. The Jim, aj. The Dal, ad. And then the Qaf, aqo. The Ta, aqo. Then the Ba, ab. Then the Kaf, ak. And the Ta, at. So the letters within the phrase ajid qatin bakat are letters that have shiddah, where the sound doesn't flow, or the sound is imprisoned. The flow of sound is imprisoned. Now what happens with these letters is that the makhraj is actually closed. So if you remember back when we spoke about the Hamza is from the vocal cords, and the vocal cords close ya for the Hamza, which is sakina. Ya. So that the makhraj there is closed. Same with the other letters of Shiddah, the Dal for example, ad. Now the beginning of the makhraj, when you say ad, then the qalqala comes and you say ad, but the beginning of it, ad, see how the tongue touches the top? The makhraj is closed. So for huruf of shiddah, the key point is that the sound doesn't flow, or the sound is imprisoned. The flow of sound is imprisoned. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the letters of rihawa, where the sound flows with the letter. So the characteristic of rihawa is the flow of sound with the letter. And some examples, the fa, f, the sheen, ash, the zay, az. You see how the sound flows when we pronounce these letters. Now in between shiddah, which is the flow of sound is restricted, and rihawa, where the flow of sound just flows, there's something in between, and it's called البينية, which actually means in between. And that's where the flow of sound is partially restricted. It's not fully restricted like shiddah, where it's very sharp, yeah. And it doesn't continuously go, or we can't extend it like the huruf of rihawa, where we say it's kind of in the middle. So these huruf are called the huruf of Bayniyah. And the letters that have Bayniyah are Lin Umar, the Lam, the Noon, the Ain, the Mim, the Ra. So we say Al, A, An, Am, Al. So there's a partial restriction to the flow of sound. And that's because the makhraj is partially closed, not fully closed, not like the hamza where the two vocal cords are fully closed. So when we say for example, the makhraj from the mouth is closed, but the makhraj from the khayshum is open. So the makhraj is partially closed. So these ahruf, Lin Umar, are huruf of Bayniyah. They're in between. Now let's remember that when we talk about Shiddah Byinya and Rikhawa, we're talking about the flow of sound, the flow of sound. Keep in mind that the last video we spoke about Jahr and Hams, it was the flow of breath. We need to differentiate the two. So Shiddah Byinya and Rikhawa is the flow of sound. Hams and Jahr is the flow of breath. So there are two different sifat that can apply to letters. So once again, we've got Shiddah, which is the imprisonment of the flow of sound. So the sound doesn't flow, and the letters are ajid, qatin, bakat. On the other hand of the spectrum, we have Rikhawa, and that's where the sound flows with the letter. Ash, ay, see the flow of sound of these letters. And in between we have Bayniyah. The letters are Lin Umar. Let's revisit those letters of Shiddah once again and dissect them just a little bit more. Shiddah is the restriction of the flow of sound. So the flow of sound is restricted or imprisoned because the makhraj is closed. Now this is the question, what do we mean by makhraj is closed? So when we say the makhraj is closed, let's take the example of the letter qaf. So when you say it, aqo, but now let's say it without the qalqala. Qalqala is an attribute that we'll explain later. But if you take the qalqala off for now, so when we say aq, you see how the qaf, it's touching the makhraj, it's closing that makhraj. It's actually touching the meaty palate. Aq, and that's restricting the sound. That's what's imprisoning the sound. The sound doesn't go out. Same with the letter kaf. Ak. Now pronouncing it to start off, we say ak. So you see how the makhraj is closed. The back of the tongue is touching the upper palate, and it's restricting that flow of sound. So that's why we say the kaf has shiddah, because the flow of sound is restricted. However, you say ak, the makhraj is closed, and the flow of sound is restricted. But then, following that, what happens is there's a flow of breath. There's hams, just like we said in the previous video. So you say ak. I'm just slowing it down here to dissect it. So you're saying there's shiddah at the beginning and then hams afterwards. Shiddah at the beginning and then hams afterwards. Shiddah as in there is an imprisonment of sound at the beginning, and then there's a flow of breath. Two different aspects, two different sifat for the same letter. Ak. The makhraj is closed. There's no sound coming out. That's the shiddah part of the kaf. And then ak. ak. After the makhraj is closed and there's no flow of sound, the shiddah part, then there is a flow of breath, which is hams. So that's how we say the kaf and the ta. We say that they have shiddah at the beginning and hams afterwards. Now, what is the significance of understanding Shiddah Byinya or Rikhawa? What does it actually practically help us with? One of the things it does help us with is to understand why letters are pronounced the way they are when they have a sukoon. So when we say the hamza, ya'ti, ya'ti, that's a very short and sharp pronunciation. As we said, we can't extend the hamza, ya'ti, right? And if we say the word nasta'een, the seen here, nasta'een, see, right? There's a flow of sound. So with letters that have shiddah, the letter is short. And with letters that have rikhawa, the sound of the letter, when it has a sukoon, is long. And the letters which have bayniyah, the letters of lin umar, for example, na'bud, na'bud, the length is in the middle. So shiddah has a short length, or the letters of shiddah are short, and the letters of bayniyah are medium in length, and the letters of rikhawa are longer in length. Shiddah is short, bayniyah is medium, rikhawa is long. But of course, to gauge and get the correct length of letters, that can only be done by practicing with a sheikh and getting it through talaqi. In the end, this is theoretical, and the only way to apply the theory is with a sheikh or a competent teacher. Now let's recap and summarize to make sure we've touched on all the learning outcomes. The first thing we said was, what does Shiddah, Byinya and Rikhawa mean? We said that all three of them are characteristics of letters that have to do with the flow of sound, the flow of sound. And we said that with the letters of Shiddah, the flow of sound is imprisoned. So there's no flow of sound. With the letters of Rikhawa, there is a flow of sound. And with the letters of Byinya, the flow of sound is partially restricted. And we said that with Shiddah, the makhraj is closed, and with Byinya, the makhraj is partially closed. And we defined the ahruf that have these characteristics. We said that the ahruf that have shiddah are combined in the statement ajid qatin bakat. The ahruf which have Byinya are combined in the statement lin umar, and all the remaining letters have rikhawa. And we said that, practically speaking, Shiddah, Byinya and Rikhawa help us understand the length of the letter when it's pronounced, when it has a sukoon. And the letters that have Shiddah are short, sharp. The letters which have Byinya are medium in length. And the letters that have Rikhawa are longer in length. But again, that can only be gauged or corrected through reading to a sheikh. And we'll see you in the next video as we continue to talk about Sifat which have opposites. We'll see you then. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.